Welcome, everyone. I'll let the attendees start to pop into our Zoom meeting. Before I begin and introduce the panelists, I'm Dr. Elisia Cohen. I'm the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
I see attendees continuing to join, so I'm going to wait and pause just a moment while the Zoom meeting populates, but we're going to go right ahead so that we can stick on schedule. Welcome, everyone. My name is Elisia Cohen, the director of the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. And I want to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors, the Minnesota Society of Professional Journalists and the Twin City Black Journalists. And I will be posting and sharing links to both of those organizations in just a few minutes. Today's panel will be discussing the topic of covering community from the perspective of journalists who are both residents and part of our communities. I'm joined today by several panelists. I'll start with introducing our senior lecturer in the school who teaches classes on community journalism. That's Gayle Golden, who we call affectionately Gigi, who teaches in our classes, in our program. Other additional panelists are Madeleine Baran from APM Reports, Harry Colbert Jr., editor of North News, Mukhtar Ibrahim, editor and publisher of the Sahan Journal, Mel Reeves, editor of the Spokesman-Recorder, and Matt Sepic of NPR News. This event is a one in a series of webinar town hall events hosted by the school on the roles and responsibilities of journalists and communication professionals during this time. Today is just one piece of the conversation, providing some perspectives from the community. There are many others and many angles to consider, and we expect there will be many questions. As the host of this event, I need to go over a few logistics at the beginning of our conversation so that you know how best to participate with us. First, please know that this is a secure webinar that is being recorded. We plan to upload this recording to our website and social media next week so that you may share it with others and that this work that we do together today can benefit our student and others who might not be able to be with us today in this moment. Second, our panelists will talk for about 30 or so minutes or more answering questions that we have prepared for them, but we do plan on answering questions that you community members might also have for the panelists. We will answer some of those live. You may ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box. To do that, you need to locate that box on the bottom of your screen near where your mute or video button is. Go to the bottom of the screen and where you see participants, and to the right, you will see Q&A. If you click it, and you can type your question to the panelists. You can do so by your name or anonymously, whatever makes you feel the most comfortable. We will be the ones who see the Q&As. We will answer as many questions as we can live. If you have questions that we are unable to address, please feel free to send me an email or others at the school, and we'll try to do our best to respond. I'll now turn the program over to Gayle Golden, who will moderate the session. Gayle? Gayle, I need to ask you to unmute. We are still.
Yep, there you go. My apologies. Yep.
Not ill.
Yeah, thanks. So what I'd like to do is first say how grateful I am to the panel for taking the time with us during this very exhausting and exacting and busy time. We really, truly do appreciate it. And I also want to say that when I teach students the class in community journalism, many of them tell me afterward it is one of their most meaningful experiences at the Hubbard School, because it's a chance for them to do reporting that they don't often get a chance to do, which is face-to-face, that has real impact on the people that they're talking to. And it's journalism that tells stories that are often hidden or outside of a larger, more mainstream narrative. Your communities today have certainly been in the mainstream narrative this past 2 weeks with the death of George Floyd and the unrest that followed, which has profoundly impacted your communities. And now this national narrative has sort of broadened, and the major networks have turned elsewhere, but your communities remain. And you are there for them. And so what this webinar is designed to explore is how community journalism organizations in the Twin Cities are continuing, as they always have done, to cover their communities. What is distinctive about the community journalism you do versus mainstream journalism? How are you doing the work? How is that impacting the communities that you serve, especially those with marginalized and vulnerable people or minority groups? So first, a broad question to each of you individually to introduce you to the audience. I would like each of you to speak about the work that you did from Floyd's death through the protests. What decisions did you make in that time, and how did those stem from your community focus? Mel Reeves, you're the community editor at the Spokesman-Recorder, which was founded in 1934 and which is the oldest continuously operating Black newspaper and the longest lived Black-owned business in Minnesota. Would you start with that question?
Yes. Yeah, I wear a few titles. We call me the community editor because, you know, I wear another hat. I'm also an activist. So I'm actually the editor, pretty much the managing editor, but community editor, so I can kind of wear both my hats without folks getting too nervous about it. So what makes us distinctive, obviously, is that we're African-American paper, and the African-American, you know, newspapers came about starting way back with Mr. Russworm with Freedom's Journal in the early 1800s. And the idea was, of course, at that time, Black people were free and unfree. And so the idea was to advocate for Black folks, both free and unfree at the time. And so it's moved into modern days. It was really important, like this paper got started in the 30s. And that was because, as in most communities, the mainstream press was not telling the stories of Black people and African Americans. In fact, worse yet, if you look back at a lot of the old mainstream press, even the New York Times to some extent, they actually, if they didn't advocate for violence against Black folks, they quietly supported it, or they reported it as if it was the norm. I looked at some of the old papers in the down south and even a few further north, and they would report on lynchings as if it was something that, you know, it was just, they just reported on it like it was okay. So the mainstream press wasn't telling our stories. And then also, because we're an oppressed people, we kind of needed somebody, or at least a vehicle, to speak out on behalf, at least around things we can agree on, like, you know, basic civil rights and that kind of thing. So we are, on some level, an advocacy journal. We tell stories, but we also take sides. And let me say that the mainstream press takes sides too. They're just not honest about it. Nobody's objective. That's an impossibility. If you're a company, you clearly have an interest in maintaining the status quo. Unfortunately, people don't talk about that. So, you know, we get pressure on us, like people look at us like, looks like you might have inserted yourself and stuff. So we try not to do that, but we try to tell the story from the people's perspective. And since we cover people of color, we wind up covering obviously a lot of social justice issues. One being obviously racism, police violence is something we've been covering before. So actually for us, you know, we didn't have to do anything special. The problem I had was we depend on freelancers. I don't have a full-time writer. And one of my best freelancers was out of town. So we wind up, because a lot of people said, hey man, it would be great to get the voice of the man on the street. And there were so many protests that even if you got one out, the next day there's something else. So what we wind up doing, we took advantage of the fact that I'm an activist and kind of have been in the streets and know what's going on in the community, to do a little more news analysis kind of deal, to do updates with less interviews of people on the street. We got some of that in, but I knew who the leaders were, so we got a chance to talk about who the leaders were. We got people, gave people a chance to get a real overview of what people are saying. So, so that's what we did. And I think we did it pretty well. If you go to our site, spokesman-recorder.com, you'll see we got a little bit of everything from, you know, a lot of different perspectives. So like this week, we've got a man on the street, woman on the street thing based on the constant vigil on 38th Street. We've got the press conference covered by the group of folks that have been organizing the protests. And you know, my editorial kind of takes a look at how this thing kind of plays out broadly. So that's what we've done.
And I definitely want to return to two things that you mentioned in there. One is the notion of your activism and how that meshes with the journalism you do. And the other one is the issue you mentioned about whether the mainstream media are actually covering the stories of the community. But so let's put a pin in those and move on, because they're both really interesting ideas. Harry, you were an award-winning community journalist in St. Louis and then here, and you had just taken the job of editor of the North News, really, I mean, almost really days, right?
Right.
Right before George Floyd was killed. And you made a conscious decision to expand your community coverage beyond North Minneapolis, the north side, when you learned of his death. Can you just talk about how that all unfolded and sort of what you did in those days?
Absolutely. First, thank you for having me. And I have been covering the community before my time at North News. I was at Insight News, which is another of the African American newspapers here in the Twin Cities. I was there for 10 years, with 4 years being the managing editor. On May 11th, I took over as the editor of North News. On May 25th, George Floyd was killed. So basically, we've got a span of like exactly 2 weeks between my coming on at North News and the probably most pivotal news story of our lifetime taking place. And so in your first couple of weeks, you're just really trying to learn the lay of the land and understand the processes and procedures and kind of back office things. Keep in mind, this was all happening during COVID. So we're doing a lot of not in person, but Zoom meetings and things of that nature. So you're still a little bit behind on things. Memorial Day, we were just having a general meeting about design and things of that nature for our May paper. I come home, I go to sleep, and the next morning I wake up to the video. And I'll be honest with you, I have still only seen the video in its entirety one time, and once was enough. I don't want to see it again. Unfortunately, because of social media and the news, you'll still see various clips or seconds of what happened to George Floyd. But for me, I don't need to see the full video again. And in fact, it's traumatizing to see the video. In terms of the conscious decision, as I mentioned, so I'm coming in, Kinsey O'Keefe was the outgoing editor, and this happens while we're in the middle of transition, and both of us made the decision to say, hey, this happened in South Minneapolis, but there are ripple effects that can be felt in North Minneapolis, and how can we justify the coverage? And what unfortunately ended up happening was the story came to our doorstep anyway, with the burning of several North Side businesses as a result of the aftermath of all this. But we made a conscious decision early on that this was bigger than geography. And so we immediately began covering the news happenings, the protests, the things of that nature. When you talk about national coverage, one thing that I do want to say is this past Thursday, and Mel was there also, but at the funeral for George Floyd, when I got there, and it was being coordinated by a national organization, and they were trying to put me in a certain room at North Central University. And I asked the people there, I said, well, who's in the actual chapel? And they said, well, CNN and AP and Reuters and I think CBS. And they kept naming all these national organizations. I said, well, I have a problem with that. And they looked stunned that I was voicing that. And I said, this happened right here in Minnesota, and our organizations have been covering this. And when those organizations leave, our organizations are going to still be the ones covering the story. So I said, even if it's not me, local press has to be inside for the covering of this. And thankfully, they quickly understood that I was correct and let me in to cover. So that's kind of been what's been going on, and we're obviously still covering it. I'm writing commentaries, and we have a piece coming on mental health and amid COVID and amid the protests and things of that nature. And so it's a story that we'll be covering for quite a long time.
Okay, thank you, Harry. And Mukhtar, you, as editor and publisher of Sahan Journal, you're building a community news organization that is bringing a voice to Somali and other immigrant communities in Minneapolis. And so I'm wondering how you approached the coverage from that angle.
Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Good to be here. Good to see former colleagues, professors, board members. Yeah, so we cover Minnesota's immigrants and refugees. So we are not covering latest developments about what happened or the protests in general, but we are very much involved in writing about what's going on. We go to the protests to meet with sources and connect with potential people that we can profile or write about the issues. So some of the stories we have reported so far deals with, the location of the killing is a very diverse neighborhood where there are a lot of immigrants from different communities, Latino, Somali, Asian, and other communities. So that was really something that we focused on when we were covering this case. We heard the story about the businesses that were damaged, that were owned by immigrants, how they formed night patrols to secure the buildings and businesses. We reported about young Somalis who came out really in large numbers to participate in the protests. Young people, especially women who are wearing the hijab and scarves. We did a story about how some members in the Asian community were targeted because the officer who was involved in the killing was Hmong. We heard about how even this case is sparking discussion about racism in the Muslim community. So though we are not really covering the case in general, we are covering from different unique, meaningful angles that are important to our community. And we are actively reporting on different threads and different angles to what's going on. And we hope to continue that.
Thanks, Mukhtar. And Matt Sepic and Madeleine Baran, I'm going to clump you into one thing there because both of you work for American Public Media. So both of you are working to cover the protests for NPR News. Matt, you're a reporter for NPR News who reports out of Minneapolis, so that you were actually doing your job. Madeleine, you're an investigative reporter with APM Reports, and your most recent work was spending a year living in the community of Winona, Mississippi, reporting for season 2 of In the Dark podcast about a racially charged death penalty case. So but you were helping out. You also both live near, in the community of where all of this was occurring, rather close to where Floyd died. So Matt, when you were doing that reporting, how were you thinking about community when you're out covering something like this? I mean, I guess explain what you were doing in your role as it compares with what the others have had to say on the panel, just briefly.
Well, I was doing breaking news. I was out on Tuesday night when the protests began, and the following 3 nights, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, when the unrest really began ramping up. And I was not really doing the type of produced packages and spots that I normally do. If you listen to NPR News and you hear my stuff on Morning Edition, I was out there reporting live as it was unfolding, because it was a breaking news situation. Constant changes following the unrest, particularly along Lake Street, which is where I was stationed. And yes, it was close to my house. George Floyd was killed at 38th and Chicago, which is about just over a mile from where I live, and in the other direction you have Lake Street and all the unrest there. So in terms of community, this is my community, and the key goal that I had that night was explaining what's going on to people who live in that area, particularly who are interested in, what is on fire and what's damaged, and how the police and eventually National Guard are responding, and if they're responding, and where, and what are their tactics, and really just explaining that in real time, making sure that everything that I am putting on the air is accurate, and things that I'm tweeting are accurate, and correcting them when they're not, and just really trying to do as good of a community service as possible by relaying that information as it happens, because it was one of these situations where it's not an event and it's done, and you have a story that you write and it goes on the air and then you move on to the next thing. It was a constantly evolving situation, and I was doing live hit after live hit as I was walking around with Madeleine and our colleagues from APM Reports. And also keeping in mind too that NPR News is a statewide network, so this coverage is going out across Minnesota, and we want to obviously portray what is going on in Minneapolis accurately, and explain things to people who are not as familiar with the neighborhoods and locations as I might be living right in that area.
Madeleine, do you have anything to add about sort of the thinking about community journalism versus sort of the regular act of pulling together journalism reports from the night?
Yes, I'm normally an investigative reporter, so I was in a role that I've done many times before, but just not recently, of breaking news like Matt. And like you mentioned, I live in the community. I live like 2 blocks off Lake Street. For me, I saw my role that night as sort of doing 2 things. One was to document the protests that were happening. We had like a complex situation that I think people on this call have done a really great job of reporting on, where you have people that are there to protest in a really more formal way. There's people that are there to protest for the first time and trying to figure out what that looks like. There's some people, really young people there, like 14-year-olds, 12-year-olds protesting, so there's just a lot happening. So there's that aspect of it. Am I doing justice to the protests that are happening? And then also, a very important, being there to witness whatever the state's response is going to be. So, when Samara and I were there late Friday night, we weren't seeing any police. And of course, there's ominous feeling, because why are we here to begin with? We're here because of what the police did to George Floyd. And so when are the police going to come in? And what's going to happen? It's very important for journalists to be there to witness whatever that is going to be. And so there was this moment where all of a sudden, kind of almost in like a stormtrooper type fashion, law enforcement starts marching down the street. And I just felt like, even as a breaking news reporter, that I was hopefully performing a public service just by being there to report on whatever law enforcement ended up doing to the protesters at that particular moment.
So Mel, I'd like to return to you, because you brought up your role as an activist and the ways in which you manage that in relation to the Spokesman-Recorder. But I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that. How is it possible to have that role and also be a journalist? How does community journalism make that possible? Does it? I think that's a little confusing to some people when they think about a journalist, because classically, you're really supposed to separate those things. So can you help me understand how you kind of understand that and get your head around that?
Sure. I can use actually just one name, Ida B. Wells. She began to raise awareness about lynching. She also had to write about it. In our community, there's no pretense. We know that folks who are active sometimes have to write about it. Sometimes, a lot of times, folks who have been active or active are also journalists. They also write. And so it's not that odd for our community. I stay out of. I don't write stories that I'm intimately involved in for the most part. So that's how I avoid that. Like when I was at, but at the same time, it's a tricky thing because I don't want to be written out of history. We had a journalist at the Spokesman-Recorder who, because I wrote back then, I was just writing on occasion, and I wrote a column called Millennials. Some people may be familiar with it. I've written that column for a very long time. And so one of the reporters, when he would go to events we would organize against police violence or against racism, that I would actually have organized, the writer would not quote me because I was connected with the paper, and we had a conversation about it. I said, you can't write me out of history. And so it seems like the two don't go together, but I can be as objective as anybody else. And especially considering I've had lots of experience, as you can imagine, as an activist, even with journalists who have preconceived notions about what's going on. And I've seen them do it dozens of times, where they show up on the scene and what they report has nothing to do with what was on the scene, or they have a preconceived idea of what's going on. And so they interview the person that fits their preconceived notion of what's going on, which is not objective, you see. So I say that I'm not objective, I'm not overly subjective. I tell the truth. What I try to do, we try to tell the truth as best we can and let you figure it out. But we don't pretend that we're not. I'm not gonna pretend that I'm not a Black man that's in the community. I feel like I'm having a hard time explaining this, but it's a fine line, but the two come together. I mean, the two make sense. We're telling stories from the perspective of our community. And if we could tell the other story, it would be clear, because the mainstream press tells a story from a perspective. And if you've ever been on the scene, let me give you an example and I'll stop, where there was a shooting and somebody witnessed it. More often than not, the witnesses don't make the newspaper. The official accounts make the newspaper, or maybe a witness that fits what the reporter thinks. And so newspapers hire folks right out of journalism school who have some preconceived notions about what's going on in the world. I see it all the time. So the advantage I have is that I know I have some preconceived notions. So I'm able to lay them down. If I went in your community and reported on it, I would look at it directly. I would just report what I see. That way I won't get in trouble. But when people leave stuff out, they tell a whole different story. And it's fascinating how to do it. So yeah, we don't feel like we have to defend ourselves. We tell the truth the best we can. We lay it out there. If we do news analysis, in fact, I notice in the mainstream press, they write news analysis, but they don't call it news analysis. I say reporters are inserting themselves a whole lot more into the story. So I think we're just more honest, to be honest with you.
So, and do you think that that's possible, just pushing it a little further, because you're a community news organization, that you think you have more freedom to do that, to make that move, and to sort of lay that out there?
Well, as I pointed out, that was the reason for the press initially. Black press was, different presses do different things now, but the original intention was for it to advocate for the community unapologetically. Right.
Okay. Mukhtar, did you want to say something?
No, I think Mel has made a good point. I think, in journalism schools, we are trained that, we have to be objective and all that. And it's hard to really have that around your head when you're a Black journalist who is out in the community and who probably have experienced some police interactions, and you will have different experience than your white colleagues who might not have those lived experiences when you're covering this kind of issues. So I think it's good to be fair to people and trust, witnesses, and always be skeptical of official narratives. We have seen that in the statement that Minneapolis Police Department released when George Floyd was killed. And if it wasn't that video that came out, that would have been the narrative. And so I think I tend to agree with Mel on some of his points, but we also have to be fair and listen to all sides, and make sure that we are not coming with our own thoughts about what happened, than just being honest with who we are, and making sure that we are listening to people and trusting them and deeply connecting with communities. And that's the reason I started Sahan Journal, because I felt the stories that I truly care about wasn't making in the news, and the media was largely overlooking those stories. And in a short period, we have seen that there's a large gap, and in less than 4 months, we won one of the best awards in the local media scene.
Hey, thanks, Mukhtar. And Harry, I was interested in something. Shortly after Floyd's death, you published a column that was a Q&A interview with yourself, and you scripted it as two people. You talked about it. It was Harry Colbert, journalist, interviewing Harry Colbert, Black man. And I was interested in that choice and why you chose to do that column and what kind of reception it got. And so I wanted to ask you about that because it seemed a particularly, particularly interesting column to put in a community news source.
What, like you said earlier, as journalists, we're taught to be that fly on the wall and not make ourselves a story. But as a Black man, this is my story. And to piggyback on what Mel said, and keep in mind, as I said earlier, I come from Insight News, where we were part of the Black press, and so I'm very familiar with that type of storytelling where we're allowed different freedoms to tell our stories. The reason I chose to do that is because, and this goes back to 2015 when Jamar Clark was killed, and Mike Freeman made the decision without consulting a grand jury that he was going to not prosecute Dustin Ringenberger and Mark Swartzy, the two officers who were ultimately responsible for Jamar Clark's death. Well, when he made that decision, and for the first time we saw the pieces of video that were being released, once again, the official narrative kept saying one thing, but what my eyes were seeing in that video were saying something totally different. I'm seeing a young man with his back turned to police being pulled out of frame by an officer, and then next thing you know, within seconds, he's dead. So after he made that decision, I reported on that decision as a journalist. As a Black man, I walked out of the room and I cried. So that's why I decided to let people know that, yeah, I have a job and my duty and obligation as a journalist to be objective and to give you both sides of the story. As a Black man, I have an understanding and an awareness of what life is really like for me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I wanted to juxtapose those two interests in showing Harry Colbert, the journalist, versus Harry Colbert, the Black man. And so that's why I made the choice to do that, to show, honestly, a lot of people, when they think of journalists, they think of us in a robotic type sense, and I wanted to show the humanity of it.
I'd like to turn to, thank you for that, Harry. I'd like to turn to the issue of building trust in a community. I think maybe I'd like to go first to Madeleine, who did extensive reporting for In the Dark for a year. She lived in an outside community in Mississippi, her reporting for season 2 of In the Dark ultimately freed a Black man, Curtis Flowers, after 2 decades, most of which was on death row, after 6 attempts by a white prosecutor, whose jury selection process was shown several times to be racially biased. That reporting involved building trust with a Mississippi community around a matter that was divided by race. My question is, how does a white journalist from the North build trust in a Black community when those racial issues are so longstanding? How did you build trust? And then I have some follow-up questions about trust in this community. And yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, for us, you know, when we went, I lived there for nearly a year, and we've been reporting that story for I think 3 years now total. I mean, when we were greeted as a novelty by the whole town. The town's 4,000 people, so it's like, who are these reporters? Why are they here? Regardless of what race you are, it's a weird thing that we're there to begin with. But what it really broke down was like, if you think there are problems in the criminal justice system, or even if you just think the criminal justice system should be investigated, you were glad that we were there because we were there to investigate it. If you thought that there really weren't problems with your criminal justice system, or that there was something almost offensive about interrogating the criminal justice system, then you were not happy that we were there. And so it didn't really have to do with how people felt about the case we were covering so much. It had to do with these larger issues. And certainly us being like white Northerners was viewed a very particular way by white Southerners in the town. And so I think it's very fair to say that we were not welcomed in a warm way by most of the white people in the town. But having said that, it's not like, oh, okay, fine, so we're not going to talk to part of the town. I mean, it's still our job to talk to everybody, regardless of how they're viewing our presence there. But, and I think how you do that is just by continuing to show up, continuing to be reporting, show that you're willing to put in the time to do the reporting. And so you want, you know, you want to understand. That was much greater challenge on the white side of town.
Mel, did you have anything to add about building trust? You unmuted, so I wondered if you had anything to add about building trust in the Black community among white journalists today.
Hmm.
I mean, you.
I didn't mean that.
No, I didn't.
I didn't mean to. If I did, no, we don't have the problem of building trust because we're a part of the community.
No, I mean, white journalists. Do they have the trust of the Black community today?
Some do and
That's
some
too
don't.
general. Okay.
How
some do and some don't. And a good example of someone who gained trust during the 4th precinct occupation, the 18 days, one of the journalists from KARE 11, Jana Shortell, she was out there in the middle of everything, and she let her authentic self show that she was concerned about not the story, but the people involved in the story.
So Matt, what are the things that NPR or that you do, you know, to try to build trust? What is it, the daily practice that the hard work that you try to do?
Well, getting out there, talking to people for one thing, and the question that we always ask is one that the late editor Tony Randolph always would ask, and it's something that I hope is on the minds of my colleagues. It's certainly on our minds too, and that question is, who are we not talking to? And what are we doing to widen the circle and include as many people in our coverage and these conversations as we can. And I think because we're a news talk station, we have talk shows as well. I think our talk shows, Angela Davis in particular, Carrie Miller as well, are really thinking hard about that as they book guests and come up with topics to move the discussion forward as we cover this monumental event. So there's our coverage on the street and planning the stories for the morning, the produced items that we're doing, but also the talk programs are really a key part of that, and we're always open to new ideas in that regard.
Is that working? Anybody? Or are there more challenges? Is there more to be done? Anybody have suggestions?
I think what people run into sometimes, Matt was saying, we want to hear from different voices. That's a bit of a paradox because sometimes the voices that people respect and are heard sometimes gets played off, or sometimes voices that are a little out of the norm, because my voice is a little out of the norm, but people in the community, whether they agree with me or not, accepted it. And so, because I even think I've dealt with Matt from time to time. And so sometimes I understand my voice gets out there quite a bit, so let's go hear from somebody else. But sometimes the voice gets out there, and that's the voice that pretty much is what people are backing. And there's a fine line there because you want to get away from that voice because you've heard it too much. But sometimes that voice is the voice of the community. Mine's probably seldom is because it's probably a more radical voice, but sometimes it is. Right now it is. And so sometimes we'll go off thinking about balance, but that's not how the community sees it. Like we'll bring a fourth perspective in that nobody's ever considered, nobody's taken seriously. That drives people crazy too. When some voice and everybody goes, how did the heck that guy get interviewed? Or how did she get interviewed? You know, she's opposed to it, you know what I'm saying? So it's good on one hand because it does give a round perspective of the community. But see, that's taken out of context. See, reporting a lot of times is done out of the political context. The Black community is an oppressed community, which is why people are getting it. That's why people in the streets all over the country, people understand that. And the press going along slow doesn't understand it. And sometimes they don't want to understand it. So when our community is not put in the political context that it actually exists in.
And to Mel's point, I mean, one of those voices that we didn't really include in coverage until now was this movement to abolish the police, defund the police. Activist groups have been talking about that for a number of years now. We've received news releases about it, but it seemed to a lot of us in the mainstream press that it was such a fringy view and such an impossibility that, all right, well, we'll set that aside for now. But look at, I mean, we have 9 city council members seriously discussing this as we move forward in terms of what is next with public safety in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and then going back to when the governor and Commissioner Harrington and the mayors were announcing that the protest had been infiltrated by white supremacists, we community journalists and particular Black journalists have been saying back in 2015, because we were hearing from our sources on the ground that, hey, there's some people here that are not with us and we think they have ulterior motives. So we were telling that narrative 5 years ago, and now other people in media are picking it up and saying, oh wow, we didn't know that. And we're like, no, we knew it and we were saying it, but once again it was considered a fringe story, so people didn't give it as much credence. And then the other thing is, when you're talking about telling authentic stories, and our stories, whether it's community based on ethnicity or community based on geography, the reason that we have a lot more street cred, for lack of a better word, is because we're there and we're visible, whereas the people from larger outlets, it's viewed as drive-by journalism. So they're in and out and there's no connection. And when there's no connection, especially if you're talking about a community that has been oppressed, then you automatically think that the person coming in is coming to further the oppression. So there's a lack of trust with a lot of journalists there, except for a lot of our community journalists.
So I guess what I'm also seeing, this seems palpably different from the aftermath of the shooting deaths of Castile and Clark. It's ramped up nationally, but I'm wondering if you can say, all of you, how the death of Floyd has had a different kind of impact on your communities. And, you know, as you can say going forward, just reflect on, is this really different? And if so, how will this be different for you in the work that you do?
I'll say it's different. And I think it's different for these reasons. I'm hypothesizing here, but with Jamar Clark, once again, there was eyewitness account, but there was no video. And even when the video came out, it still wasn't conclusive video in some people's eyes. With Philando Castile, there was video of the immediate aftermath, and but there wasn't video of the shooting. So there was still a room for people to theorize as to what happened before Diamond Reynolds turned on her camera. With the death of George Floyd, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, you saw from beginning to end the killing of a man. And so that in itself is what makes this difference. different. There was no plausible deniability in what was being viewed there. Before, you had all this plausible deniability, and that's what people hung their hat on. So here you have no plausible deniability, and you have the other factor that I don't know that we are fully even capable of grasping, which is COVID-19. By that, I'm saying, because it was COVID-19, you didn't have basketball, you didn't have football, you didn't have baseball, golf, or any other entertainment outlets. So any of your distractions were removed. So the person who saw that video had to see that video, process that video, and then not say, oh, well, let's go to the club tonight. And they had to process it and continue to understand what they were witnessing. The lack of distraction, I think, helped a lot in changing the tenor of this conversation, as well as the fact that we saw it from start to finish.
I would just add to that. I agree with all of that. And I would just add also, like, the work of activists for so many years plays such a role now. So it didn't come out of nowhere that you had people with great community organizing skill that were able to mobilize large numbers of people in large protests, and be really smart politically about where to assert that power, to try to make things change. So I think it's a lot, you never really know how effective those movements have come until you meet opportunity and the power of a movement, and you see what can happen.
And I think too, what makes this case different than all of the others, as Harry said, is that lack of plausible deniability, and the fact that the video shows the whole incident from beginning to it's excruciating, and I think it finally made a lot of white folks understand what activists and others in the Black community have been saying for so many years, since these incidents began being recorded on cell phone video and in other places. There are a lot more people in the broader community now who get it and may finally understand. And you can see that in the political conversations and the widespread response to it, because there's really no room for equivocation given what all of us saw.
Yeah, and I think, the recent killings that we witnessed, the high-profile killing of Philando Castile and Jamal Clark, and then this one within a couple of years, I think people are really fed up seeing young Black men being killed. And I think that also contributed to the intensity of the protests and the demands and all the things that are going on. If you go to the protests, it's just not the Black community, it's really diverse. And I think this case really opened the eyes of a lot of people about the things that were happening to the African community, the injustices, the killings, the humiliation and all that. And a lot of people have, started showing solidarity with the Black community.
I wanted to say, if I can pitch in here, that you asked what was different. Am I on? Okay.
Yep.
You asked what was different. A lot of things are different, and you've heard lots of people say this. People are fed up, and so this has been boiling under the surface for a long time. I think the other thing feeding this, and Harry has a good point about people not being distracted. Remember, they had been bottled up in their homes. They also had seen how this government responded to the pandemic, right? People didn't have, people on the front line didn't have PPE. Some of their parents suffered, some of their relatives suffered from COVID-19 for no other good reason than they didn't have PPE. They were on the front lines, which, some of it was pretty mean-spirited. A lot of companies hid the fact that people were sick, causing other people to get sick. So really callous and insensitive things were going on. They saw U.S. corporations being cavalier with human beings. And I think around the country, around the world, people seeing it. So I think that's the other part that fed it. And if you notice, a lot of young people, these young people were already pushing back against, what they had been programmed to believe. They'd already been doing it. And so this gave them, if you notice, there's droves of them. I think this gave them opportunity to come out, because the people who didn't believe, a lot of people who didn't believe still don't believe. They're willing to give up a little more ground. But it's a matter of choice. A lot of people choose not to respond to what happens to folks. They say, oh, that's terrible. And then also it happened in an environment which we just saw Ahmaud Arbery killed on tape as well, remember? So it was Ahmaud Arbery, and not just black people, white people saw it. Breonna Taylor was killed. Here in this local community, Douglas Lewis was killed by a guy that had a fender bender. The guy gets out of his car after the first conversation. He follows Douglas. Douglas gets out to find out why he's following, and he shoots him like a cop stands there, takes a cop position and shoots and kills him. So all of that, and Jamar Clark, all of that is in everybody's consciousness. So what we're seeing, what's very different, and this is not a moment. This is we're in the precipice of a movement. Now the system's going to push back, but people are saying now they don't want the police anymore, not like they had them. I mean, the abolish the police thing is going to have to be reined in, obviously, on some level. But people are saying clearly, we don't want the system of policing as we know it. And if the system continues to insist on having a system of policing like this, then it will have to go. That's where we are. We're at a moment, you all, in time in history that none of us have seen before.
Yeah, and what I'd like to ask is, now that the sort of the national news journalism organizations have gone, what is the work that the community journalism organizations need to do as your communities move forward in that movement? And what are the challenges that you face in doing that work?
I would say trying to figure out what's next. We have this movement now with the city council about the next steps for MPD and what is going to replace it. Just trying to report on that and explain it to the audience, I think is the biggest challenge that personally I see in reporting on this, because the council itself has not really articulated any kind of plan for how they're going to move forward with this and what legal mechanisms they're going to use to do it. So, and there are, I think, probably going to be some competing narratives there. And as Mel said, the inevitable pushback from the system. So just trying to stay on top of that and do it accurately will be, I know, a challenge that's going to be with reporters in this town for a long time, because Minneapolis is going to be at the forefront of this national story about reforming and coming up with a new model for public safety and what it looks like in America.
And I know in North Minneapolis, one of the things that we'll be looking at is several businesses along the West Broadway corridor, and then even businesses that are not along West Broadway were damaged and some completely burned to the ground. There's going to be a rebuild. The question is, who's going to benefit from the rebuild in terms of, will these be, many of these companies were PLC owned. Will these companies come back as PLC owned? Will the work be done by PLC laborers and things of that nature? So it's about, for us, we'll be looking at following the money in terms of one of those questions.
And the rest will be doing a little, go ahead, Mukhtar.
No, go ahead, Mel.
Yeah, we'll be doing a little bit of that. We'll be following the money because I think I heard the Polat Institute is going to give $20 million. So when the money thing gets spread around, that causes issues in our community, because people mean well, but sometimes, I've worked, as you know, I've organized a lot of different groups that just kind of on the fly, coalitions that fought injustices, and we've seldom received any money. And so some group that organizes itself much better than we do, a fanciful, gets a bank account or whatever, the money gets poured into those, right? And Harry knows what I'm talking about. And then folks in the community start saying, hey, these people got money. It's like, what can I tell you? We didn't get any of it. So a lot of money is going to be poured into the community. I think part of it is a way, some of the money is going to be poured into the community as a way of kind of trying to mitigate the protests and shut it down on some level. And some people are going to bite. And as the smoke clears, we're going to be reporting about the people who become opportunists in this. It always happens. Also people who aren't keeping up with where things are. For example, the Congress, the Black Caucus, is behind the people. I mean, the people are way ahead of them. We'll be talking about that. There's going to be a reckoning after this, and then we're going to go back to business as usual, because the Black community is still going to be discriminated against. Like Terry said, we're still going to have to be paying attention to who's got all the construction jobs and what the construction workers look like. You know, stuff like that. I almost said foolishness. Yeah, foolishness like that in a society that we brag about being, you know, an exceptional one and democratic and all that. And that's what the outpouring about rage is about on some level. And I want to correct you too, Matt, about something. You said the uprising. You said something earlier. Yeah. So Wednesdays when most of the stuff happened. If you notice, we called the protests on Thursday and marched 6,000 people through downtown, and not a window was broken. So there was that day of burning and looting, and some stuff did get burnt a little bit later. But for the most part, that happened in one day. And us activists and leaders, human rights activists, political activists, we were able to kind of get out in front and steer this thing toward a direction of, that's why people stayed in the street, right? They gave us a cop. We said, no, we didn't want the one cop. We want all four. They gave us Keith. We said, no, we want somebody even more independent than him. So people are not going to be satisfied until these folks are actually convicted. And this movement could spring in a lot of ways, because people, this is really about not just police violence. And I think some people are picking up on it. We'll be writing about this. We'll be writing about the fact that people are upset about a whole lot of things in this society. And that, you know, our community is absolutely tired of discrimination. We want to throw it out, whatever has to happen to throw it out, so we can live in a society where everybody has equal opportunity. I think that's what's on the horizon. That's going to be pressed. People don't want to live with it anymore. That's the sense I'm getting, and that's what we'll be writing about.
Yeah, I think also staying with the story is something that, you know, all local media organizations are good at doing when the rest of the media go back to their places. So holding elected officials accountable by their pledges, is this the funding issue, how is that gonna go? And making sure that we are really explaining what that means, staying with local business owners and how they're gonna cope with these damages that they have, you know, sustained in their businesses. The relationship between the community and the police, is it ever gonna change? And making sure that we are really focusing on writing about the police department in a more aggressive way, and making sure that we're getting all the records that, you know, reporters are looking for, and making sure that, you know, the pledges and reforms that, you know, the police chief and the mayor are calling for, if that's being met, or if that's just, you know, just a talk.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we leave, because we're getting very close, I wanted to just ask Madeleine if she could just give, you know, kind of just a couple of thoughts about how to stay in there for the long haul on trust and cultivating trust through a story. You know, what are sort of a couple of tips for just really burrowing in and cultivating trust? What do journalists have to do with that?
I feel weird giving that advice to this group that has way more experience doing that. So just having said that, I guess as an investigative reporter, speaking specifically to my own experience, you know, powerful people and institutions can sustain 1 day story, 1 week story, 1 month story. I mean, they're powerful. That's how it works. Where you can really make a difference is through repeated ongoing coverage, where you say, like, I'm going to keep requesting public records. You're going to keep making statements. I'm going to keep checking them with public records. I'm going to keep digging into the budget. So I'm not going away. And you're not going to like, this is going to go on forever. Like, you know, maybe not just with me or my news organization, but with journalists in general. And so I would hope that what we see, like to Mukhtar's point, is a really renewed, and maybe like we've never seen it before, aggressive coverage of the police in the Twin Cities. And I guess what I mean by that is a lot of, like exactly what Mukhtar's saying, a lot of public records, a lot of sourcing. You know, these newsrooms are going broke. And so it's like, how can we do this with this time of reduced resources, but really getting creative about how to develop those sources in the police department, how to really examine structures of power in the police department. And that's the work that a lot of journalists can do, I think, a lot more than we're doing right now, to hold people accountable.
Thank you all. It was a great discussion, and thank you for the time that you gave today. I'm going to give it back to Elisia.
Thank you all. I want to thank each and every one of you who have the trust of your communities with your wonderful, wonderful news outlets and all the hard work that you're doing day in and day out, not just in this particular moment, but throughout the lifespan of your work. As a school, we're not exempt from thinking through the issues of how we are including diverse voices in our own work and thinking about who we're talking to, who we're recruiting, who we're hiring, et cetera. And so I am so appreciative of each and every one of you for being part of our conversation. We will use this conversation to help teach our students to do better, to help cover communities. And I look forward to partnering with you and in the future. So thank you all very much for your time today, and we'll be in touch soon. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you.